Hello everyone and welcome to SPARTA. Today's guest is Tai Shani, who's going to talk about two of her works. One is called DC Productions and the other one is called The Neon Hieroglyph. And let's see what she's going to share with us today.
Hi Tai Shani.
Hi. Hi.
Where are you actually at right now? In the UK, I guess.
I'm in my bedroom in London. I didn't get to go to the studio today, so I thought I'd do it here at home.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Great. Okay, we'll have the Q&A session later, as usual. And as we already talked about before, you can take as long as you want. So looking forward to a long and detailed talk.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pia and Till, for inviting me. I'm going to talk, as you said, about these two projects, and I'm going to slightly meander sometimes, and we're going to show a little bit of film as well at some point. I always start my talks with this image because I think there's something about the kind of intensity of it that really is something I strive towards in my own work. There's something magical and transportative, and also it's from a film by Alexander Ptushko that was known as the kind of communist Walt Disney. And all these films and productions were made in camera with incredible analog effects, and I really love it. So I always put that at the beginning of a talk. Okay, so DC Productions, it began being called Dark Continent, and I changed the name of it halfway, or even later, 2/3 of the way through the project. I took the original name Dark Continent from a Freudian text about girls' sexuality, and he referred to women and girls' sexuality as a dark continent. And after a few years, it was brought to my attention that this was a word that was used a lot in kind of colonial reference to Africa, and I decided to not use that word that term anymore, and changed it to DC Productions, and also in a way that kind of embodies a lot of the methodologies of it, because it was a framework, for a productive framework, let's say. So it was an ongoing feminist project iterated through character-led installations, films, performances, and texts, which began in 2014 in a show called Mirror City at the Hayward Gallery. So this is the image of it. So I think that this was even though there are some works that are before this that are part of this in a way, this was a really strong turning point for me. I think that previously to this, my politics as a citizen were quite nihilistic. I think I kind of was interested in very grand philosophical narratives that were nihilistic in terms of how you thought about community, how you thought about society and accountability towards each other. And something had really fundamentally shifted in my worldview at that moment. And I wanted to find a way as an artist to contribute to a discourse around feminism. At the time, it was quite basic in a way. And I wanted to find also tools to write experiences that I thought were unpalatable and missing from, from wider culture. So in 2018, I presented a piece called DC Semiramis, which was the culmination of the project. So it took 4 years. There were 12 characters. that the kind of end presentation was a series of 12 performances that took place over 4 days. Each performance was led by one of the 12 characters that lived in this city. So this is what eventually kind of I ended up showing quite a lot of afterwards, because it got nominated for the Turner Prize, and also it became quite a visible project. So even though to me that was the end of it in terms of a lot of the research and the kind of thinking, it also like had this other life that was out of my control afterwards for a few years. So I'm going to show you a few images here from performances. All of the performances were kind of looked at the idea of tableau vivant, like a living painting. So they were very still. Not a lot of movement, not a lot happened, but many characters on this installation. And to the side, there was a narrator that would read these very, very long monologues to the camera. And there was a projection of their face reading to the audience. When I started, like thinking about doing this idea with the 12 characters, it was an idea that I wanted to do for a very long time. I was always interested in this kind of epic, durational, large-scale projects. And for many years, I tried to get people interested in funding a project about a Roman orgy of like 29 participants with 29 body doubles of themselves. And no one was interested really to help me, find a way to produce it. So this was in a way like but that was the right thing, if that makes sense, because even though it was interested in a lot of the same formal concerns that the work became embodied afterwards, it didn't really have a kind of center of gravity. It was just like I wanted lots of people in this long duration, very affective experience. And it was only, through these 4 years of writing these texts that had lots of research, I'll talk about the characters afterwards in more detail, that I think I was able to give this kind of vision of an epic performance a center of gravity. So when we started doing the rehearsals for it, I had all these ideas of all the characters moving around a lot and doing all kinds of things. But when we actually started looking at it, it looked really messy. And it made sense for it to kind of be suspended in its own time, in the same way that conceptually this city is suspended in a different time, in an always elsewhere as well. I was lucky enough to restage these performances in different places. And when I restaged it, I was also able to kind of emphasize and highlight different performative qualities and different ways of thinking about how this operates as a performance. Here, this was at Nottingham Contemporary, part of Still I Rise, an exhibition that looked at the kind of genealogies and legacies of feminism and feminist art. And here, I only had like 3 performers and the narrator. So it changed completely what the piece was. And I worked with a dancer, and we created quite a lot of choreography for this. The 3 performers were all dancers. In the bigger, so here's a close-up so this one was much more physical and much more expressive in terms of like the physicality of it. And this was the restaging of the 12 character one. And again, like the performers in this piece, there were performers from very different kind of, let's say, show or performance, body, movement, legacies and traditions. So there were dancers, there were mime artists, there were people that were like proper theater kind of, that were used to, giving huge kind of roles in very traditional theater. So it was also interesting bringing together these performers, but also, in a way, their roles were kind of reduced by the form of the tableau vivant. So these are some close-ups. Okay. So the whole project was an experimental and expanded adaptation of Christine de Pizan's 1405 proto-feminist book, The Book of the City of Ladies, within which Christine, the writer, builds a city of women with the help of justice, reason, and rectitude. This allegorical city aimed to counter the suspicious and misogynist beliefs of her time and advocates for the importance of women's social participation. The city she builds is not only for women, but it is made of women. They are the building blocks of the city. So here in this image, this is an illustration from the book. You can see that like they're building a city, but each of these blocks is a narrative, if that makes sense. So each block is an actual character, and she draws, you know, from like, she doesn't really make these distinctions between myth and history and like local and fantastical. And I think that was quite a medieval way of looking at the world. So let's say, you know, she would talk about a Greek goddess and then talk about someone who lived in the village next door, or, you know, that kind of thing. And I was really interested in this kind of flattening as well of myth and history. And that was something that I took on in the project as well. So what was interesting to me is she was interested in seizing control of the way women are represented in literature as well. And she calls on to all women to contribute towards a feminist hereafter from the book. So it was written in 1405. In my naive mind, I was, you know, hoping that it was going to be, because I'd began looking a lot at medieval mystical texts. I was really kind of blown away. I'll come back to that later, but I was really blown away by the texture of that writing. It's very psychedelic, very expanded, very kind of speculative, even though it's all about the divine. You know, the divine is such an abstract kind of notion that it really was an expanded form of writing that had also feminine subjectivity somehow at its core. So when I came across this book, I had very high expectations, but it's also a very Christian book, and it's very pious. You know, it's about like being a good wife and, you know, doing right by men and stuff like that. So, you know, it wasn't the kind of mind-blowing, reforming experience I hoped, but it's still a very, very interesting text, you know, especially written at the time. So I think that now I've maybe moved on from this, but for many years, I used adaptation. So DC Productions is adaptation and is an adaptation. And through my practice before DC Productions, pretty much all of my work was an adaptation. And I think that maybe it's to do with the fact that I'm not trained formally. I don't have an art education. I don't have any education, but I don't have an art education more relevantly. And cinema and books and art became like my kind of education. And there were certain ideas that I could see within certain like cultural artifacts, films or plays that articulated my concerns, and I was interested in finding a way to almost use them as an anagram, but in a very abstract way, in a very kind of affective way, you know. So I was never interested in following the narratives that were in any kind of adaptation I did. I kind of really was interested in exploding it. So I was particularly interested in adaptations that had historically been political, ideological, or philosophical agents. And for me, this was a really great productive structure to think and construct within. So I'm going to give a few examples of adaptations that I did before the big one that I did for 4 years. So this was Michael Powell's Peeping Tom. And what I really like about certain films or plays is that within them they already have these kind of like contact relics of other adaptations, if that makes sense. So in Peeping Tom, there is a real Medusa kind of narrative in it. so it's not an adaptation of that myth, but you can feel that myth running through it. There's a young man who's a serial killer, and he builds this machine where he kills women, and it's a tripod, so it's a camera. And one of the legs of the tripod has a dagger at the end. And the camera itself, oh, I didn't have a picture of it. The camera itself the lens sits within a mirror. So the person who's being murdered looks at their own face while they're being murdered, and he films, and that's what he films. And it's very resonant with the idea, the myth around the Medusa, of looking at the face of fear, in a way, of a kind of spasmodic fear that's very primal and that also like is fatal. So taking that kind of story of Medusa and the eye, I made a piece called The Idol Eye and Stone Idol Eye. So again, like a play on words. And it was looking at two different optic mythologies. So one was the Medusa, which was the purple one on the table, that there was a photograph of her face on a bag. And there was Lady Godiva, which also has the peeping Tom idea. So it kind of took certain ideas around our appetite for erotic, the eye's appetite to look and consume erotic, pornographic kind of imagery and violence. And it looked at these two kind of compulsions, like optic compulsions. So I often use this picture of Frankie to kind of talk about my process. It's kind of a useful way. So a lot of times things happen in a very non-formal, non-kind of structured way. I was in a gallery and I saw Frankie. Well, I didn't see Frankie. I heard Frankie. I heard the sound of something that I didn't understand what it was. And when I turned around, I noticed that this person had let down their hair, and the sound of like this really long hair was a sound I hadn't heard before. And I just like turned around and looked at her, and I approached her and said, would you be in my work one day? And she said, yeah, I'm a life model. So yeah, definitely. And then many years later, I was asked to do something in a room that had this horse in it anyway. And I was like, I have a Lady Godiva. And that's how I decided to write. So often the kind of kernel of my work is something quite like a coincidence. It can be like a song I hear and there's a tone that I want to reproduce in language or in an image or in an object. Antigone. So this was an adaptation of Antigone, that all the different Antigones appeared, like not all, there's so many, there's thousands of Antigones, but I chose 4 different Antigones. I chose like a Cocteau Antigone, a Sophocles, Kierkegaard. And actually one of the Antigones I chose was from this really incredible film, a German film called Germany in Autumn, I think it's called in English. And it's an omnibus film from 1977 that Fassbinder and various directors contributed short films to make this whole. And it was in response to the RAF and the Baader-Meinhof activities at the time. And the segment that was presented by, or not presented, but made by Volker Schlondorf, sorry for my pronunciation, was a really interesting piece. So in it, the piece was about a kind of boardroom of television executives. And they were talking about the ethics of showing an adaptation of Antigone, which is a very special play in the way that it talks about state and the way it talks about civil disobedience and the kind of interplay between law and morality. And they were talking about what the ethical kind of ramifications would be of showing an adaptation of Antigone in the middle of revolutionary, like non-passive revolutionary activity, if that makes sense. And it's a really interesting piece of work. And I thought, okay, I want to reference this. So like when you use something like Antigone, it anyway has already so many meanings and so many associations, and it kind of brings all of that into your own work. So like you don't have to, it's almost like there are these ghosts that come with these characters, or that come with these films, or come with these adaptations. They're full of like this other life, which are like zombies, you know, they kind of exist there, and they move and they do things that are related to their own like histories, and you can kind of be in relation and in conversation with that. And I think that that was very useful for me for many years. These are some stills from Welt am Draht, which is a Fassbinder adaptation of a book called Simulacron 3. So I also did an adaptation of, so this is like a kind of adaptation within an adaptation within an adaptation. I did an adaptation of this radio play called The Tunnel Under the World. And that was then adapted into a book called Simulacron 3. And then Fassbinder adapted it in a television series, a 2-part series called Welt am Draht, World on a Wire, which is incredible. And I really recommend to watch as well. So I did an adaptation of that as well. Here, they're like the main character. We teleported the main character from the film that was, it's a lot of my work before I became, when I was a nihilist, let's say, was very complicated, but for no real purpose. So this was a very, very, very kind of complicated story about CCTV and parallel cinemas and where fiction lives outside of the screen. And we brought the hero from Welt am Draht into the cinema through these 3 time machines. This is Dali, Salvador Dali, very unpopular guy. His Dream of Venus pavilion, which was a pavilion that he made for the 1939 World Fair. And I was commissioned by the Barbican to respond to it in 2011. And I did a kind of play about the women that played in this, if that makes sense, because it was a very avant-garde piece that he had a lot of problems with the person who financed it. And because of this, he wrote it out of his canon, if it makes sense. But he actually, I think it's one of his best pieces. It was like a performance space, and the walls were made out of glass. They had water in it. There were real live performers that would swim in it. There was a soundtrack. I mean, it was like very, very, very contemporary as an idea. And I think it's like definitely the most interesting. Well, he did many interesting things actually, but this one of the best things he's done, I think. So I did an adaptation of that, and I did a lot of research into the actors that were playing in his piece. So at the time I was interested in the idea of actors and fiction, but you see, that's the thing about like being an artist in a way, is sometimes you don't see your own self at all. And when I think back about why I was so obsessed with the character of an actress, it's very clear for me that I was interested in, you know, how gender is performed and how feminized subjectivities are performed. So like the character of the actress is like perfect for that. It's also a kind of object or a kind of subject of desire that like both you know, it's like desired but also impossible. So I was always interested in them, and a lot of the pieces that I wrote at the time were concerned with their lives and how they identified with the characters that they were playing. Okay. So the first thing I showed you was the communist Walt Disney, and this is Walt Disney, and I was brought up on, you know, like this kind of cartoons were the things that I saw as a child. And I had very strong experiences with these films, but not just these films, also different like children's stories. And I think when I understood, there was a moment, I don't know at what age exactly, that I understood that it was made, that this wasn't nature. Do you see what I mean? That it was something that someone had produced. I wanted to do that. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be part of that kind of tradition. Well, not even tradition. I didn't have any of these words in my mind at all. But I was jealous. I wanted to make also. I wanted to, you know, like there's a really, it's not completely true, by the way, but I really love this story. So I'm going to say for a minute it is true. And then I'll tell you that it's not true. But the word abracadabra, which is like the word for magic, it comes from Hebrew, which like is a kind of deconstruction of the words ivrei kedvarai, which means as my words, so it shall be. And I love the idea that magic is like as my words, so it shall be, like as my thinking, so it shall be. But actually it's not true, because I did do some research into this, and it's a myth. It's one of these kind of knowledge myths, unfortunately, which I'll come back to actually in another piece. So feminist science fiction. I grew up, I'm going to read a bit because I wrote this a few months ago and I really was happy with what I wrote. So I'm just going to read this bit. I grew up in a hippie commune in Goa at the twilight of the countercultural era, when all the incredible politics and explorations had been dissolved by disappointment into some kind of nihilistic hedonism and a cocaine-fueled transformation into a libertarian neoliberal betrayal. Science fiction was some of the first fiction I was given to read when I learned to read when I was 10 and finally entered the educational system. Authors such as Pamela Sargent in The Shore of Women, Sally Miller Gerhardt in The Wonderground, and Susie McKee Charnas in The Motherlines has served as a significant narrative device to articulate feminism's ultimate goals, egalitarian civilizations, and realities beyond gender. Writing is also very much at the core of my work, and although I hate it, it brings me to the edge of my sanity. Something happens in the writing that does not happen in other facets of my practice. The writing is often a struggle of translation, of a perilous journey that brings discrete affects into the shared space of the world, of the word. The object and image making is again a process of interpreting this into materials and compositions. The scholar Amy Hollywood has a paper called The Unspeakability of Trauma, The Unspeakability of Joy. This is the problem that guides me from dread to language. Ineffability, or the inability to put into language, is like a mystical experience to me always. And that process of trying to bring that into language is a kind of spiritual process for me as well. So I was going to read you bits of text, but I think that I won't, because in the piece that we'll see, there's quite a lot of text. There's 7 minutes of text. So I think that's enough for today. So as I said before I started working on this project, I began to be interested in these medieval mystical texts like Teresa of Avila, Hildegard von Bingen, Porret, Julian of Norwich. And there are also experiments into trying to bring into language the unspeakability of their love and their mystical eroticism, or eros, which is also a form of divinity. So, yeah, the unspeakability of eroticism and the unspeakability of death. These are two things, I think, the polarities that are often in the writing, at least that I do, or kind of concerns in the writing that I do. So when I was first introduced to these mystical texts, I was immediately struck at how much they are incredible examples of what Hélène Cizou terms as écriture féminine, a form of writing that foregrounds the political importance of language for the psychic understanding of self. So I just want to say something here about some of the references that I speak about. Like, I think like for me, there are interesting ideas, like there are problematic ideas in a lot of 1970s French philosophy, feminist philosophy, but there are also interesting things that I think are worth salvaging. And I think that a lot of the writing is also contextual to that time. And the idea of écriture féminine, which is like the inscribing of feminine experiences into language, if it's taken out of an essentialist context, I think is still an interesting and relevant thing. I think when it's wedded to biology and to essentialism, it becomes really uninteresting and also a bit like, just like not of use to anyone really. So I'm going to just talk about a few, very quickly run through the kind of things that I was looking at in the project in terms of the theoretical underpinning of it. So Luce Irigaray on excess, Donna Haraway on hybridity and kinship, but a lot of this, like this is over 5 years. So a lot of it I kind of also refused by the end completely. Bataille on transgression and limit experience, Audre Lorde on fictionalizing the deeply personal and the autobiographical and how to use that to speak of a political category. Catherine Malibu on plasticity and gender, Judith Butler, of course, Toni Morrison on whiteness and the fictional imagination, Ursula K. Le Guin on world building, Maurice Blanchot on limit experience, the image and myth, Octavia Butler on the politicization of the speculative, Elaine Scarry on torture and pain, and Sylvia Federici on the institutionalization of rape and prostitution, as well as witchcraft, and a kind of Marxist reading of, well, I'll come back to her, because like, in a way, there's something that, I want to talk about in relation to her a bit later. So these are the kind of things that I was looking at visually. I don't know if you remember that first, or do I have, no. No. Okay, so at the beginning of the talk, I showed this pink kind of city, or a part of a city behind glass. And a lot of the sculptural, architectural elements were taken from this model, which is a miniature of Palmyra. And it was done in 1777, I think, by Elizabeth Radcliffe, who was a servant for an aristocratic family. And she was incredibly gifted as an artist, basically, and would make these incredible models and various different things. But I kind of like how 1960s it is as well, with like all the glitter and the mica. And it kind of is in this weird, unplaceable temporal space, which is something that, I try to do with my work as well. This is La Strada Novissima, which was built for the 1980 Venice Biennial of Architecture. And it was a series of facades that was commissioned by architects. And they just existed in this long street in a kind of hangar. So there was no, there was nothing behind them. It was just facade, facade, facade. And it's like so interesting to me, like even things like how, King Ludwig had set builders build his castles, that it was like actually like these opera makers that were building these kind of like these simulations of historical non-places. So in a weird way, this is also like that. It's these facades that behind there's literally nothing. It's just like that's all there is. But also I was very haunted by a recurring dream as a child of trying to find my way in a street where everything was constantly moving. And there's something about like postmodern architecture that has this weird collapse in it as well, of like kind of neoclassical and brutalist, and everything's kind of happening at the same time. And there's something about that I really, really like. It's become very fashionable as well, I know. So, but that's okay. That happens also. This is Super Studios Continuous Monument. Again, this was like really central to the thinking of because I have limited funds I didn't have a lot of money to make this project ever. Like, it was never very well funded. But I really wanted this city, which I call now a post-patriarchal city that I was building, to take more conceptual and imaginary space than it could ever do physically. And in a way, this like continuous monument, which is like a monument that just goes on forever, but obviously, you know, doesn't exist and spans impossible spaces, is a monument in time, but not in space. And that's something that I took forward. So this is Site Architecture Studios, and they did like these supermarkets that were called Best. I think the owner was interested in them as a kind of architecture studio, and he or they commissioned Site to make these very theatrical supermarkets. And yeah, I think there's something about this everydayness of them and them having a function that's like really wonderful. And and this is Charles Moore's Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans, which again is just like threshold, 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 door, 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 door. Yeah, almost like a physical taxonomy of an object, but in one place. I think that's quite interesting to me. Okay, I'm going to have a sip of water, if that's okay. So these were the things I was thinking about with this project. A space to imagine an alternative history which privileges sensation, experience, and interiority, undermining patriarchal conceptions of narrative history and constructs a possible post-patriarchal future. The main question in my head was, what would a post-patriarchal avant-garde epic be today? The traditional epic tropes that fascinate me were apocalyptic potentials, the interiority of panoptic heroines or heroes, deep time. And by the end of this project, I was left with more questions about what was the point of it than I was at the beginning, in a way. I was very, very sure of it at the beginning. And by the end, like the kind of political reality had shifted, or I had become more aware of it, let's say. And I just I wasn't as sure anymore about what was so necessary about my voice to be this kind of, in this declarative political mode of come join this revolution. You know, like I thought there were much more urgent, more educated and important voices that should be, you know, like visible in that way. And also, you know, how revolutionary can artists be? You know, we all work in these awful places with bad money. You know, like I know that in Germany, it's illegal to show work by artists that support BDS. You know, I think they're like very serious things that are happening in terms of the institutions that disseminate art that really put in question and jeopardize any kind of political expediency that artists may wish to propose, really. So, I mean, yeah, it's not a very optimistic thing, but that's it, really. So each of the 12 episodes focused on one character, delivered through prose monologues, very violent, erotic, lots of fantastical images told in a very dense floral language that reimagines feminine otherness as a perfect totality with myth, science, history, you know, like kind of mechanisms for all those things within this piece. So performance and the voice was the conduit of my practice. The performed text, the voiced language creates an arena for contemplation and an immersion in the potential politics proposed by the text. So I was more interested in it being an invitation than a critique in maybe what I was used to at the time of being critique of like, this is bad and this is good. I didn't want to be ambiguous, but I wanted to kind of propose like something after that in a way with this project. So I'm going to talk you quickly. I'm looking at time just so that I'm aware. because I'm not even halfway through, I'll be honest. I'll speed it up a little bit. I did 12 characters. I'm going to talk you through them. So this one was Cube of Flesh. It's an adaptation of Bluebeard, where all of the 7 wives of Bluebeard were conflated into one. I was approached by a death metal fanzine at the time to write a piece for it, and I was interested in the kind of vernacular and language of lyrics of death metal bands like Gorgasm. So I wrote an adaptation that was as gory as possible, as kind of disgusting as possible. And from the perspective of a body that becomes an object, a body that becomes a cube of flesh. So she's killed 7 times. There is a clear split between the body as object and subjecthood. She's shot, stabbed, hung, impaled, decapitated, mutilated, and crushed. Her body becomes an object that's used until it has no more function. It's ruined, destroyed, dehumanized, an abstract mess of flesh reconstituted into a cube. Nothing more can be done to it. So I wanted to think about the idea that nothing is forbidden in a way, but not in a free speech way, but in the sense that I didn't feel that it was my responsibility to not think about violence, if that makes sense, or to not explore violence. I didn't think that I should not be allowed to trespass into it. And I wanted to kind of also reclaim it into a feminist politic. Neanderthal. So this character had both a penis and a vagina and was able to reproduce without another person. And I was interested in writing about a subjectivity that doesn't have language and isn't kind of defined by what we understand as language. Medieval mystic, so she's built into the wall of the city and is in love with a sculpture of Christ through a window that is like the same ratio as a screen. And she sees the statue and is completely in love with it. And again, I'm interested in the language and the psychedelic nature of the writing of medieval mystics, and how they write about these experiences that are unbound, but yet held within the confines of the irrationality of religion. Their texts are corporal, excessive, and erotic, and realize the sphere of the other. So this character had a few different embodiments. This is a symbolic portrait of that mystic. So here the mystic exists as like pieces of animal, different kind of body parts, pieces of sculpture. Let's Eat Grandma did the soundtrack for this project. I often work with musicians, and since then I've been working consistently with Maxwell Sterling, who you'll hear some of his music in the piece that I'll show you. So this was Woman on the Edge of Time, and she was named after a Marge Piercy book. All the characters also, before they start their monologues, what I did was I created these paragraphs for each character that introduced some of the research that went into the character. So for example, this one, Woman on the Edge of Time, there was an introduction to the Marge Piercy book and a kind of some of the themes that are in that book and other things. So each character talked about the body of research before they began their monologues. The vampire. So she lives at the bottom, or they live at all the characters also are very unplaced and unfixed in terms of gender. So the vampire exists at the bottom of the sea and is like really on that kind of threshold between life and death. And she has, or they have this psychic anemone that is fused to the clitoris. And when the anemone moves, the vampire has an orgasm. And that's how they tell their, they come back into kind of, coherence. And that's how they tell about their genesis story, about how they came to be and how they were made from a cut in the reel that like bled and this little drop of blood became a lump. And then, like, you know, it's like a Prometheus story. And in the same way that, like, God creates Eve for Adam, the vampire creates a body double for themselves to feed off as well, like creates their own kind of other. Nemesoid is a piece of software that reconstructs human experiences that lives on the edge of language or representation. I don't think we have time for me to read any of this. I'm going to move on, and at the end, maybe if you want, we can yeah, I have time, I'm told. Okay, so this is a good way to show you what I mean by those little introductory texts. So the following episode from DC Semiramis is told through Nemesoid, an open source software program named after Mnemosyne, mother of the 9 muses, and the symbolic embodiment of memory in Greek mythology. The software was created as an interface for the Eternal Cortex project, an aggregated, almost infinite database of experience stored on the server farm, HDS Zenobia Pink Data Center on the edge of the hologram. Through a frequent integration bioalgorithm, Nemesoid renders the input of language, image, and fiction into high-fidelity sensory formation that can be experienced from the point of view of self, other, animal, or object. In this episode, Nemesoid is at the point of the heat death of the universe, or maximum entropy, a popular 20th century cosmological hypothesis about the ultimate fate of the universe. This serves as a construct to conceptualize the end of time, or a strange circularity where the end touches the beginning in a singularity. This is also an aid to imagine the paradox of the immaterial software within the collapse of matter, with no input. Nemesoid replays moments on the limit of experience that have defied its capacity to produce a satisfactory sensory dimension, monuments of intense touch, love, erotic, and spiritual, and self-consciousness. Phantasmagorgasm. This used a very, like, kind of trope of Gothic fiction, you know, like a haunted house, a family in a haunted house. So this is like kind of the symbology, and this one is more narrative. It's like 2 sisters that are cursed. They have to constantly bury the decomposing corpse of their father, and they have to scream about love or other things too, but they have to scream to keep the body underground. If they go to sleep or stop screaming, the body starts to rise and goes into their house. And he kind of reappears in this room that has a portrait of Dagny Taggart on it. And the portrait of Dagny Taggart is a terrible heroine from an Ayn Rand book. So he exists behind this kind of horrific, you know, like neoliberal and libertarian capitalist kind of portrait as well. So very heavy symbology throughout it on this one. And again, like I used to often do these performances a few times, if that makes sense. So I'd you know, I'd do them in different settings, like that was in a theater and that was in a kind of art event. But also this piece exists as a VR piece where you go through a house and you hear this narrative and you're going through spaces. I don't know if you can see here, there's a body on the floor. It's not very clear, but one of the things I'm really interested in VR, and I've done another play since. I'm interested in like the kind of, it's still quite crap, you know what I mean? It's not really good yet, but there's like really interesting things that you can think about. Like I work with this animator, programmer, like genius person called Adam Sinclair. And I was saying to him, I really want to, like, how can we do a VR that represents darkness? Like what would darkness be in a VR experience? So this is a little bit too, this is a lighter image than it was. It was very dark, but there was a dark spot in front of you. And wherever you looked, it was always in front of you, if that makes sense. Like you couldn't escape this dark spot. Psychic anemone. which appears in different ways. I told you about how the psychic anemone like moves on the clitoris of the vampire, but they're also an AI, and they are an AI that can communicate with the dead and also can travel in time. And I think that there are maybe not that many organic humans in this city. Maybe we're not organic, I don't know. This is psychic anemone as a sculpture, as an installation, and that's it in a slightly different way. And okay, shall I read another little bit, or is maybe okay, I will read it to you. So okay, so this is Paradise. It's one of my favorite characters, and maybe this is actually a really good time to talk about something that's, so when I did the, when I wrote this project and was really deep inside it, I thought I was like interested in, creating this speculative world that would make you think about the current world in different ways and make people want to kind of think in other ways about how to move forward. But then in retrospect, after it finished completely, when I started thinking back, what I realized was that a lot of it was a way to talk about trauma and to talk about both typical and exceptional trauma in a way that would be open for other people to come in, so it wasn't confessional. It wasn't like this happened to me, but it's completely confessional as well. That's of course the way it is. So it pretends to not be autobiographical because I use these avatars, but it really is. And in this piece specifically, I won't talk about what it is because of, like I don't want to trigger warn it too much, but this piece is very, like this piece kind of was a full stop, if that makes sense. Like I said something in it that was so difficult to say, and that was it. Like the curse or like the spell of this language and trauma had been kind of changed, not lifted, but it transformed. Okay, so Paradise. Algae-Lux are therapeutic AI that mine human genomic data to retrieve typical and extraordinary trauma narratives to self-generate empathy faculties. I would not know how to be sincere enough to independently communicate the details right now. I would not know how to invest wisely in language right now. I would not know how to backpedal from syntactic ambiguity right now. Organic research. Oh, wow. On the white mulberry leaf, the silkworm secretes a sticky protein from its salivary glands, which hardens when it comes into contact with the outside world. It twists the filaments into a double helix. It spins a cocoon, creating an armor of secretions to protect its vulnerability during brutal transformative processes that recalibrate violated subjectivities. It emerges as pure transmission. Okay, there is one thing I know for sure. I need to tell it to you. I will never be able to safely love my dear dead daddy. Okay, I'm gonna skip a bit. I want to steal fire. I want to use my private basic language on you. I want to reach catharsis all over your beautiful face. You organize this violence. I want to fuck you like an animal. I want to macerate you, absorb and metabolize you. I want to make you cry. Our conceptual dependency. This is our fatal magic. You are my shroud of byssus. You are my shroud of a bleached sea silk, so rare and so fine that it can be folded into a matchbox and kept on my person at all times. God's eye may be on the sparrow, but my eye will always be on you. Okay. Mirror, strange character where all the text kind of was, this was more formal, the text would go back and forth. And also Teenager, which I wrote a lot about my kind of, experiences of growing up as a teenager in the 90s. And being a fat girl and being sexually very amenable. So I wrote a lot about that. So, sirens. Again, this is like looking at language and the sirens as a kind of vehicle for language and sound and the margins of nature and the kind, you know, again, these like very, very expanded mythologies. So here are some images of the installation. In different countries, different places, different embodiments of it. And this is the book that was all the text together. So, okay, I'm going to just say one thing about this. DC Productions deployed the central ideas of Sisou's écriture féminine, inscribing the excesses of femininity in the hegemonic patriarchal order. Writing that wants to intoxicate, be purple, transgress. A lot of these feminist theories and philosophers were what we could define as essentialists, but I believe it's our life's work to transform and reimagine ideas that are useful and then reclaim them, not just throw them away. When I first became interested in feminist scholarship and activism, I wasn't anti-trans at all, but in retrospect, I had wanted an essentialist position on gender because it was the only way at the time I find I could address the rage that was bubbling in me about my experiences of gendered violence, sexualization, and discrimination. I wanted there to be some feminine mystical realm that could explain the phobia and violence. My absolute lack of imagination left me only able to relegate this yearning to weaponize my otherness in the confines of an unambitious biology. I read about queer feminism, Black feminism, trans activism, colonialism, white supremacist, intersectionality. I spoke to people, had discussions, and completely repositioned myself. And in that transformation, better and multiple potentials unfolded for what an emancipatory feminist politic could be, that extended far beyond the horizons of an essentialist feminist biological position, which ultimately seeks to rule equally in a house that is rotten to its very core. In my writing, I tried to transform some of these ideas that had initially drawn me into thinking about gender and sexuality. In Our Fatal Magic, all the characters are unfixed in terms of their gender and biology, but they all inhabit femininity as a mode of subjectivity and social interface. A feminism that isn't invested in anti-racism, anti-capitalism, isn't invested in trans rights, sex workers' rights, and an intersectional, emancipatory, equitable center of gravity is meaningless to me. I don't want to be part of it. TERFs are not feminists. Capitalists are not feminists. Racists are not feminists. Feminism isn't about being a boss. We should abolish all bosses. Okay. Whoop, whoop. Okay, so this is what I'm working now, the neon hieroglyph, and in a second we'll show a film. My closest encounters with what could be considered psychedelic culture was growing up in my commune in Goa in the late 70s, early 80s. And retrospectively, the dynamics in that dusk of counterculture were very much a reflection of wider society. And even though they advocated for progressive sexual politics, these still sat very much within a patriarchal order. Beauty and the libidinous economy was as prevalent there as anywhere else. Perhaps this is a good example of what the limitations of a psychedelic community can be. Also bound within the strictness of socialization. It makes me think that there is an illusory aspect to what happens under the influence of psychedelics, similarly to how socialized desires, which are not our own, feel all-consuming and very much our own, almost how constructs are architecture that can produce the natural or the real. I want to feel these things. So I'm wondering if the infinite space of psychedelics where ego or subjectivity is suspended, can one completely transcend our socialization even in those spaces? Or is it always already a parameter that contains an illusion of infinite possibility, a miraged edge where possibility of self blurs into some kind of incoherence that is identified wrongly as externally extending? Okay. I'm going to just say one quick thing now, and then we're going to watch the film. Historically, women gain access to public life through the supernatural. Medieval mysticism, channeling visual language of medium artists and how they share language with psychedelic vernacular, etc. Modernity makes witches of mystics, and the figure of the witch is a psychedelic one. The witch represents a threshold between the natural and the supernatural, between the metaphysical and the material. Like acid, ergot, mescaline, etc. It is an agent that both has a material and immaterial life, a threshold between two realms. The witch is also the vessel that contains the changing attitudes to excess, from her porosity to the divine, which becomes her permeability to evil, and her pliancy not only makes her a communicative conduit, as in the case of the mystics, which are mere messengers, but the witch is the human embodiment of chaotic wickedness and dark powers, and powerful she is, but she's also a wrecker of civilization and morality. The psychedelic experience is one of ontological excess. Feminine excess is contingent on the conditions of gender within the social sphere, but that socially produced excess is also experienced ontologically. Also, more basic traditional conceptions of what the feminist discourse introduces as methodology, horizontal thinking, non-hierarchical approaches to knowledge, power, experience, etc. Visceral experiences of this approach are also psychedelic. How might one create passage between a Marxist project of a future anarcho-communism, my ultimate feminist goal, let's say, and psychedelics is one of the tools that can facilitate something within that. In as much as I believe the only routes or only path that we have to imagine a kind of green, horizontal, anarcho-communism are through the current feminist project. That's the only way you can think about it, because the aims of feminism are still to dismantle the systems that would otherwise prevent that from happening. Like the real thing, feminism, which wants to tear down the whole thing and start again. Feminism is the only line of communication with the future now, or the only acceptable line of an acceptable future that we can communicate with now. We're going to show the film, and I'm going to drink some water. Lovely. Oh.
House, table, dog, fire. We are green, green atoms. Green atoms become green electrons, then green protons and neutrons, which become green quarks. We are phytoplankton. Greenly photosynthesize into photosensitive green life givers. We would be eternally green communists, eternally horizontal, eternally porous, eternally communing to collaboratively compose the epic unsung anthem of the unbroken cycle of our interdependency, a fragile ecology in the powerful movements of astral dust. We wait for an eternity under a green spiritual spotlight in the metaphysical proscenium arch. Our eyes closed, dispersing the density of the neon hieroglyphs, skittering towards the contrast of the dim periphery of the eye to become visible again. Here too, even more determinedly, we felt we had completed some fractal design, coded into the digital's hallucinogenic natural and nature's analog psychedelic, the sexual and asexual reproduction of fungus that grows parasitically on common grains, which contain alkaloids from which LSD can be derived. It was time. Our fruiting bodies, abundant and excessive, our pollinated ovaries, our multiple spores brimming. We were club-headed, erect and swelling. We survived the winter on sterile rye in the face of the deficient copper in the soil, and germinated, reproducing both asexually and sexually, bound together by the sticky sap to make pathogenetic neon hieroglyph, code writer, fungus. In the sticky sap, I came sexually and asexually, and when I came, I was a brain-eating alien. I was a snapped stalactite. I was your quivering shadow. I was a roundworm larvae, carried by a sick pig in an industrial farm. I was shimmer. I was idle. I was a distant bark. When I came, I cried in karyogamic bliss to all the quarks that realized my pleasure, my unbreachable distance from my name, from my culture, from my history. June 2020. You will die. You will die, we whisper in your ear. Sitting on your chest, we rip open your pink Play-Doh face for an anthropomantic divination of an encrypted future in your spilling carmine wound, which was once your necropolitical face on 1,000 police cars set ablaze in the streets of our beloved paradisiac hell house.
Thank you. Great. So how are we doing? Shall I continue? Shall I talk about? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this project. So again, I use these kind of like structures to make my work in. So there is definitely like a relation to the previous project in the sense that like I kind of build a skeleton and then things can, you know, like flesh grows on it, blood, different arms, different legs, you know, so lots of things can happen. And what you just saw is the first kind of proper iteration of it, which is a 9-part film, which is online and available to view all the time if anyone wants to watch the other episodes. I think that was episode 3 in the piece. So I'm going to talk through some of the ideas in the piece, and then when we maybe chat, we can, you know, explore some of them further. Okay. So when I started writing this, I was looking at this book called Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon, which is a science fiction book within which the character travels through his house, from the porch of his house, through the center of the earth, and comes out on the other side and goes through the galaxy and through the universe. And so I borrowed some of that structure, even though it's not an adaptation of it, but I did borrow the structure of going from the cellular to the galactic. So the first episode talks about a more conventional narrative, which I'll go to later, but then the second episode begins talking about entoptic phenomena. So entoptic images are visual effects that originate within the visual processing system. So they're images that your eye produces. They're not like hallucinations. They're just like, you know, floaters or phosphate, you know, like all these different kind of squiggles, dots, whatever that you see sometimes, but also these are kind of the blueprint for a lot of hallucination. But there's this, again, like I'm interested in like poetic theories, like when I said about the abracadabra, that are maybe not true, but they have this kind of excessive affect to them. So this is another one. So these are like, someone has put together this chart. So if you look at the first column, these are entoptic phenomena that are agreed, you know, the different names they have. And then in the other charts, they're looking at like the first engravings and paintings on some very, very early Paleolithic cave art. And there is this theory that the artists that were painting or engraving on the walls were documenting these visual phenomena. And there's something so kind of incredible to me about this idea, like that the cell has everything in it already in a way, and that these kind of like epic narratives on these walls are of what your body creates in front of your field of vision. And in episode 1, it talks also about prisoner cinema, which is a phenomena that prisoners that are in solitary confinement have, where they start to hallucinate basically. And also talks about crypt life, so vampires, zombies, ghosts, the undead. So when I started thinking about this project, I think the main interest I had was, why do people who go into trance, people that take any of the wonderful catalog of psychedelic drugs, and also AI, which I'll show you in a minute, why do they all share this kind of psychedelic language that is common? There are commonalities to them all. And I wanted to that was my first question. It's like, what is that? What is that vernacular? What is that kind of language? So this is Georgiana Horton, who was a spiritualist, and she painted these in the 1860s. And they're like, you know, these kind of energetic portraits, I think, of maybe people that have passed. And Ethel Le Rossignol, I love her. She painted these series of paintings. I think there were 22 of them, and they're called A Goodly Company. And they were, she painted them like she was guided by these spirits that told her to paint them. But look at, I mean, to me, this is what, like this, you could see this in a like head shop, like in a coffee shop in Amsterdam. this, but these were painted in the 1930s by someone who was profoundly religious. But again, there's something in this kind of language, like these animals appearing, these snakes, these kind of life forms appearing from like the cellular, that is like the kind of blueprint of psychedelic imagery. And then, of course, this is Google Deep Dream. So those previous ones were done in the 30s and 40s. So this is an AI generated image. Deep Dream is a process of pattern seeking and pattern recognition pushed to the nether regions of its inchoate limits. When artificial intelligence are allowed to dream, they dream in psychedelics. A fungus. It's a fungus, ergot. That's what the project is about. It's a fungus that grows on different grains like rye and barley and many different ones. And that used to be milled into flour and eaten in bread. And it's also the fungus that LSD is derived from. So, and it's deadly in large doses as well. This is what it looks like under a microscope, like lots of phallic protrusions coming off a piece of, I don't know, poo or something. I'm interested in the following ideas: temporality, cosmic and psychedelic time versus subjective human time, and capitalist conceptions of time and labor. What function can experiences of cosmic time that seem nihilistic in their scope play in a moment of time-sensitive direct action, such as the one we are in now? Climate crisis being one of the many faces of social and capitalist collapse. Atomization and collectivity, psychedelic senses of unity versus alienation. A transcendental and communal loving, a forever now within which we all exist. A dissolution of self or ego is a condition of a psychedelic experience. This is implicitly in opposition to capitalist and fascist notions of self and identity. Acid is green, acid is anti-supremacist, acid is horizontal, acid is no borders, acid is communism. The role of psychedelics in creation of traditional and indigenous animistic and pagan spiritual practices and cosmologies. What would a lost psychedelic metaphysical mythology be? One that circumnavigates the Enlightenment and modernity? Could it reimagine outbreaks and dancing plagues as sites for myth? Dancing plagues. Okay. So dancing plague. The history of ergot is a feminized history. In ancient Syria, ergot was called daughter of blood. It was used as an abortive substance until the late 30s in Europe. The dancing plague of 1518, the outbreak within 1 month, 400 dancers, predominantly women, many died in a state of like total ecstasy. Ergot can be traced to a history of religious and mystical visions. They find it in bog bodies. There are people that say that the drink kykeon, that was a drink that people drank during the Eleusinian mysteries, which was a secret rite that happened every year for 2,000 years in ancient Greece. And very little is known about it because it was so secret. But there is, a lot of substantiated kind of claims that there was a psychoactive agent in this drink, whether it was ergot or maybe mushrooms. But the whole kind of idea of this descent and ascent is an idea of like shift in consciousness, like a shift into a higher, like an ascension to a higher consciousness. And then there's like this idea that, this folklore tale that this island in Italy called Alicudi, that they had a ergot contamination between 1600 and 1949, and that everyone ate acid bread for 450 years continuously. And the mythology that emerges there is really interesting to me because in all the mythology around witches are like evil, but then this one is like socialist, like the witches would fly to the mainland, they'd steal from the rich, they'd bring like good things to, when there was famine, they would take care of each other. So I really like this idea. They'd go to like Palermo and Calabria and bring back like all these like, like riches for everybody to share. Okay. Burn, burn, burn. This is to do with witchcraft and ergot poisoning. So there's this interesting idea that, oh yeah, like a lot of, ergot poisoning, a lot of witches were just eating contaminated bread or grain, and that, they had like psychotic episodes because of that. But I think it's really not a great theory, even though it's interesting in many ways, because, it was the persecution of women under witchcraft and witch hunting was on an industrial scale, and to kind of relegate it to people like just ingesting something and then them being burnt, I don't think that's true. I think that the legacies of witch hunting is something we still kind of are dealing with now. 70,000 people were killed, predominantly women, were burnt in Europe for witchcraft. A lot of these women were just old and poor. That was the main thing. So to go back to Silvia Federici, who I don't agree at all with her current positions on stuff, but she wrote, I think she's really interesting to me, like Caliban and the Witch is a really interesting book, because it does exactly that. It talks about something that sits within a mystical realm, which often femininity was relegated to, and it does a Marxist analysis, like a materialist social analysis of that history. That's what I'm interested in now, like how you can talk about these two spheres together, that like they're always separated, the sphere of the fantastical, of the speculative, and that of the material, and like the kind of social and reality. So I think, I want to bring them much more together. But you can imagine, like the medieval imagination would have been very fertile, like thinking, like when people would be eating this bread and tripping, people would have thought they're either talking to God or that they're like talking to the devil, basically. Yes. So I think the figure of the witch, particularly the persecuted witch, is very close to this idea where the immaterial and material reality meet. So I think, these are kind of like strategies that I'm interested in. Okay.
Et ma jeune fille avait des crises terribles d'hallucination, se dressant sur son lit, voyant le sang qui tombait du plafond de partout, voyant des tigres qui bongissaient dessus, des lions, des ours qui venaient la dévorer, et alors à ce moment-là, criant évidemment, poussant des cris terribles, des cheveux qui lui sortaient de la bouche, elle avait toujours l'impression qu'elle avait sa bouche pleine de cheveux, elle s'arrachait comme ça, n'est-ce pas, pour éliminer ses cheveux, qu'elle n'y arrivait pas.
Saw tigers.
Et vous vous souvenez de quelque chose, mademoiselle?
And so did, and in like Ethel Rossignol paintings, there's also these psychedelic tigers. So there are also these animals that kind of appear in a lot of things. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up now. A House for Ghosts. So this project is about creating a mausoleum for psychedelic witches, a house for ghosts where the Gothic and the hallucinatory collide, where Gothic affects and fractal dread are interpreted into sculptures drawn from a taxonomy of burial objects, structures, and ceremony. This is Paul Feck's Burial, my favorite artwork in the world. Okay, and that's the neon hieroglyph. That's it.
So, and there we are. All right. Okay. Thank you so much. That was a sudden ending.
Sharing
after
my screen?
Not yet, please.
Okay.
Thanks, first of all. That kind of felt like a trip. And I need a little break. Let's maybe meet in 10 minutes.
Yeah,
and I will send you the link.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, and see you in the Q&A.
Ciao, ciao. Okay. Oh, I ended the live stream too early, but it's not bad. Okay, so maybe jetzt, es könnte sein, dass